Hello, welcome to another video by Moxon Marine. Even though Marine is in my business name, I also build LS engines. And this particular engine is an iron block LS2. It's an LQ4 that I've installed LS2 crankshaft, or about to install LS2 crankshaft, pistons, rods, and heads. So it's basically what's considered an iron block LS2. So if you've watched some other videos on this channel, you'll notice that this engine has already been in the truck once. And I had to pull it out because I made a pretty dang big mistake. And I'd sort of known about this issue, but didn't quite put it all together, put two and two together, and I made a big mistake, basically, honestly. So let me show you what happened. So this is the crankshaft that came out of this engine that I already had installed, and you'll see how wide that flange is. It's about an inch and a quarter, maybe an inch and 3/8 inches wide. So this crankshaft right here is a brand new LS2 crank that I bought from GM Parts, something on GMPartsWarehouse.com. It's basically Skog and Dickey auto parts out of Texas. And if you notice, the flange is much narrower. So that's the proper flange for a 2009 GMC truck. If you'll also notice, that has a 58-tooth trigger wheel. That's because I knocked the 24-tooth trigger wheel off of it and installed a 58-tooth trigger wheel myself. So I did that work myself, just like I did on this crankshaft. So the underlying problem is this first crankshaft is out of a 2000 era truck, or LQ4. And I knew there was an issue with the flex plate and hooking it up to transmissions. I knew all about that, so I bought a flex plate, proper flex plate for it, I thought. And so what it boils down to is, if you take that crankshaft with the narrow flange and you want to put it into an older vehicle with a turbo hydromatic 350 or a 4L60, something like that, then you need a special flex plate with a spacer to make it the same width as that flange. So you can take a newer crankshaft to make it fit older transmissions with a special flex plate, a flat flex plate, and a spacer. However, if you already have the wide flange, you don't need the spacer. You need the flat flex plate, but you don't need the spacer. But this crankshaft with a wide flange will not fit in a truck or a vehicle with a 2009 transmission because it requires that narrow flange. So I made a mistake. So when I put this crankshaft in there, I couldn't get the transmission bolted up to this engine. So I had to take the engine back out, take it back to the shop, turn it upside down, and I took this crankshaft out the other day, and so I'm now trying to reassemble this engine. So if you've ever wondered if you can take a crankshaft out and put a crankshaft back in on an engine that's already assembled with pistons and all that, the answer is maybe. I say maybe because I'm doing this for the first time, and I'm going to try it out. I'm going to try to see if I can do it. Well, I got it out, so obviously I can get one in. So it's just a matter of how you do it. So if you'll notice, and one of the downsides of doing it this way, it's going to be tough to check clearances on my bearings, because I can't spin. When I put this crankshaft in there, I really can't spin it because it will hit these rods. You can see all these rods down in there, and it'll hit the rods, so I really can't spin it. I might be able to spin it maybe back and forth 10, 15 degrees, but that's as far as it's going to spin. And that's what I'm going to do. When I first put the crankshaft in, I'm going to put oil on all my main bearings. Here's number 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. I'm going to oil the main bearings, set the crankshaft in there, put all my main caps on there with my new bearing, the other half of the bearing, and see if this thing turns. Because I'm not going to be able to check the clearances. I'll then use Plastigage'd to check my clearances on all my mains after I see if it turns. But I really can't properly check the clearances any other way. So if you'll notice, I've already put all the upper halves of the bearings in the block. So the block's upside down, so these are the upper halves. And I'll also put the upper halves in all the rods too, if you notice. Because once the crank is in place, I'm not going to be able it's going to be hard to get my hands down in there and put the bearing halves in the rod. So I've already got those bearing halves in the rods, as you can see. So you might ask, well, so what's going on? I got that rod tied up with wire, and that rod tied up with wire. And I'm just guessing if this is going to work. I mean, it's my best guess, but I'm going to try it. So let me tell you why I tied it with wire. So the back 4 cylinders, if you look at that crankshaft over there, right there on the new one, or the old one, either one, the crank pins where the journals are, where the rod's attached, on the back 4 cylinders, the journal will be up in the air. It'll be here and here, or it could be here and here, but it'll be 90 degrees apart. But one of them will stick 45 degrees up this direction, and the other will be sticking 45 this direction. So they'll be up in the air away from the rods, not a problem. They won't hit the rods. The front 4 cylinders is a different story. Those journals will be pointed down 45 degrees. One will be pointing down 45 degrees that way, and the other will be pointing 45 degrees that way. I've already looked at the crank, studied it, and the crank pin that'll be pointed in the front will be pointed towards this cylinder, and the one on the next 2 cylinders will be pointed towards that cylinder. So what I've done is I've tied the rod up so that as I lower this crank in there, it's going to mate with that rod bearing as I lower it down in there, and it's going to hopefully settle down into that rod, and then as I keep going down with the crank, it'll go ahead and pull this wire free. I'm just holding this up so as I mate with the crankshaft, the rod will drop on down and it'll pull the wire with it. The wire's not that strong, so, but I've got to hold the rods up. I don't have but 2 hands, so I can't hold them. I can't do the crank and hold the rods up at the same time. So that's what I've done, and I'm gonna try it out and see if it works. So before I lower this crank in there, I've got to oil these main bearings, and I've got to oil at least these 2 rods because those are the 2 that the crank will be touching when it first lowers in there. Once the crank is in place, like I said, I can spin it a little bit, but not too much because it'll be moving these rods back and forth, and can't go very far or they'll fall off. And again, so I'll be hitting this rod and that rod if I turn it too far. So that's what I'm going to try to do, and it's my attempt to put the crankshaft in by myself without having any help. So let's give this a shot. Okay, the crankshaft is now lowered into place, and one thing I forgot to mention is this rear main cap or rear main seal plate had to be put temporarily held in place or lowered in place, and when I got the crankshaft down in there, I just slid it on, but it can't be slid on all the way because it has to make room for the rear main bearing. So my idea worked. Well, I say it worked. The bearing came loose right there. I'm gonna slide that back down in there. I'll do that off camera, and then same up here. So you see the front rod did not hit the crankshaft. It went down in there without touching, and that's true on both sides. Now the back ones were no problem because the crankshaft wrist pins or not wrist pins, the crankshaft crank pins are way up here in the air. They did not touch the rods down there. So before I spin this thing around, well, obviously I'm going to tighten down my main bearings, and then I'm going to have to reach down in there and pull these rods, pull them up to the journal and tighten them up onto the crankshaft. So it looks like this, from this stage, it's worked so far, and we'll see how it goes going forward. So I'm going to go ahead and what I've got to do first is tighten up the main the rod bearing here and there, and then that'll take care of those 2, and then pull these 2, this one here and that one there, up to the crankshaft, tighten those, and then the front will be done. And then I'll worry about the back. All I got to do is pull these up and tighten them on. So I'm about to put my first rod bearing cap on, and that's for cylinder number 3 right there. And I had all the cylinders bagged, or excuse me, all the rod caps bagged so I wouldn't lose track of which one was which. The rod stayed in the engine, so I knew which number it was, but I had to bag the caps so that I would know which one went back where. And these are what's called fracture, I'm trying to remember what they call this, fracture joint rod caps, so they have to go back on the rod in the same location. I'm a little bit, these bearings have never been run on the engine, so you can see my old crank, even though it was machined, must have had some defects in it because it's kind of ruined these bearings. And I'm really concerned about that. But so about to put this rod cap back on, and I'm gonna put 2 of them on and see if it'll spin a little bit. If you notice, I've got all the boxes for the rod, the upper half of the rod bearings are already in the engine, and so as I took them out and put them on like cylinder 8, I numbered the box number 8 so that I put the matching bearing on that cylinder. It may not matter. I know the main bearings hopefully didn't matter because they were just all in one big plastic wrapper, weren't individually boxed as a pair, so I assumed they were all the same. but the rod bearings came in a box set, so I'm trying to, even though it may not matter, I don't know, I'm just assuming that the box set means that they are matched together. So this is number 3 box, so that bearing, the other half is in here. I'm going to put it in the rod cap there, and then put it on the rod. All right, I now have rods 1, 2, 3, and 4 on, and the bolts are just finger tight. I have not put a wrench on them yet. So the order in which I put them together was 3, then 2, which was down in there, and then of course I'm rocking it back and forth, move back and forth to get access to it. So it was 3, then 2, then 4, then 1. So I've just done 1. So I now have all the bolts on just finger tight. I'm about to tighten up. I can now get a bolt. It's 11mm socket, by the way. On this is number 3. I'm gonna just snug them up a little bit with a wrench, and then I'm gonna rotate it a little bit to where I can get to number 4, and then I'll snug 1 and 2 down. And then once I get them snug, I'm not gonna tighten them yet until I get the last 4 on the backside done. Once I get all the rods done, then I'll then I'll put the mains on, see if it spins. I'm probably gonna Plastigage it. I've not decided at this time, but if it spins, more than likely it's okay. This is a brand new crank, so it should be standard, and all my bearings are standard size. So if it doesn't work, there's really nothing I can do about it anyway. So I may just run it like it is. It'll be the first engine I've ever built without checking clearances. But I'm anxious to get this motor back together and get it running in my truck. All right, continue with this crankshaft installation on this LS2 iron block. I now have the main bearing cap on the number 5 and number 1, and the reason I did that is out of sequence, but I'm trying to see if this crankshaft's bent. So I did 5. I did Plastigage'd on the main bearing, and it showed me I had just a tad over 0.002 thousand of an inch, which is within specification, I believe. On number 1, I had just under, probably 0.0018, just under 2,000 an inch. So both the number 5 and number 1 had good clearance. And I've just rotated a little bit. It turns freely, it's not binding, so I believe this crank is straight and those bearings are good. So I'm now going to do number 3, the one in the middle. That's your thrust bearing, and get it Plastigage'd, torqued down, and then I'll do 2, and then I'll do 4. There's a video on YouTube by a channel called Headflow Incorporated or something like that. And he's got a video on torquing of these main bearing cap bolts. The factory specification, I think, is 51 degrees. Well, you torque it down to 15 foot-pounds first to seat it. And then you torque this one to 51 degrees, torque to angle, 51 degrees on, 51 degrees, and then I think it's, I want to say 80-something degrees on the inner tube. I'll put that at the end of this video, but he recommends using torque instead of torque to angle. So what I've done is I've used his recommendations: 55 foot-pounds on the outer 2 bolts and 65 foot-pounds on the inner 2 bolts, and of course 18 on your side bolts. They're not that critical. So I've torqued down number 5, number 1, fixed it in 3, and now I'll do 2 and 4. All right, I now have number 3 and number 4 main bearing caps installed. I Plastigage'd number 3, and I believe the clearance was just a little bit above 0.0015. So it's probably close to 0.0017 or 0.0016 maybe. It was the tightest I've measured so far. And then number 4 was just a tad under 0.002. So it's under 2 thousandths. So number 3 and number 4 are okay. So I'm now ready to do number 2, install number 2 main bearing, or Plastigage it first and then install it. But as you can see, it's way down there. These flyweights are in the way, and it's hard to get my hand down there. Plus there's a hole right there on top that you don't want to Plastigage over a hole. So I need to rotate this crankshaft. So before I can do that, I know that this crankshaft will not rotate 360 degrees around. Number 6 piston hits the valve, because if you notice, the cam gear is not on. So the cam gear is stationary and it's got a valve held open right now. And number 6 is hitting that valve. So I got 2 choices. I can either flip it over, take the rock arms off for number 6 to close the valves. That's one possibility. Or what I'd rather do is put the timing gear back on, time it, and put the timing gear on, and then I can rotate it without worrying about any pistons hitting any valves. So I'm gonna have to do that anyway, so I decided to go ahead and do that now. So at this time, I pulled this, I transferred this gear from the old crankshaft back onto this crankshaft, and I just want to show you the tools I use. So I keep all kind of little trinkets or old tools or old bearings or whatever around the shop as just spacers or tools to have handy. So this particular ring right here is a cam bearing from a Toyota Land Cruiser, 74 Toyota Land Cruiser. I just happen to keep them around because I thought they might come in useful, and they have. And this little spacer here is a timing gear retainer off of 4.3 V6, and I needed that to take up the space, or to have this. This nut, or this bolt, is the crank bolt from the last engine. I'm going to throw it away because it's a one-time use only bolt, but actually I may not throw it away. I keep it around for a tool. But so this seats up against this, which seats up against that ring, because this bolt flange will go inside that. So I had to use this as a spacer or as a washer kind of to help that get in there. So I've now used this bolt. And I made sure that I had enough threads to pull it, so I didn't pull the threads out of the crank. So I used it to pull this gear onto the crankshaft. So now that's done, I can remove all this and put my timing chain on and time this motor. And hopefully I can get it timed without having to rotate it too far and get it lined up without hitting that valve. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and then I'll continue with putting this main bearing cap on number 2. One other thing, as I was tightening these main caps, I was using, I think, 55 foot-pounds for the outer bolt and 65 foot-pounds for the inner bolts. And I just felt that was too loose. It just didn't seem to be tightening. Or like, for example, I would loosen them up to get the Plastigage'd out, and it just did not feel that tight. So I abandoned that method. I'm going back to the torque to angle, which is 15 foot-pounds to start, just a seat. And then this angle is 51 degrees on the outer bolts and 80 degrees on the inner bolts. And these 80-degree inner bolts are taking close to 75 to 80 foot-pounds. That's a whole lot more than 65, which was by the video from Headflow. So I'm going back to using the torque to angle method. It takes a little bit longer, it's a little bit more tedious, but that's what the factory recommends. That's what I'm going to do. All right, so at this time I'm going to try to reinstall my timing chain and see if I can get this thing, get the timing set put together so I can rotate the engine without worrying about the valves hitting. What this tells me, this is what's called an interference engine. If your timing chain breaks and the pistons and the valves just happen to be at the right spot, one of the cylinders, the valve is more likely going to be open out of 8 cylinders. And so that piston, if the engine keeps flywheeling and rotating, that piston is going to slam into that valve and bend the valve. So these engines are interference engines. All right, so at this time, I'm going to install the timing set. All right, I didn't like what I was feeling. I was having trouble rotating this cam gear or camshaft with the cam gear, and I felt like I might be hitting the valve with the piston, so I said take with that. So I decided to go ahead and flip it over, take the valve covers off, and loosen all the rocker arms so that all the valves are no longer open. There's no valves open right now. It took the pressure off the cam, so I can now retime the cam, and then I'll tighten the valves back down. I just felt this was the safer way to do this. So now I'm about to line up the marks on the cam gear and the crankshaft gear and retime this engine. All right, as I was saying, I now have the mark on the cam gear and the dot on the crankshaft gear in line, through a line through the center of the cam, through the center of the crank. These should be lined up pretty good, and if not, I'll adjust it a little bit. You can adjust it a little bit to get the chain to fit on, but as long as the marks line up when it's all tightened up, that's what matters. All right, the engine's now been retimed. The dot and the mark line up, and this engine is now can now be rotated without fear of hitting the pistons and the valves together. Of course, the valves have not been tightened down, but once I do, it won't hit anything. So at this time, I'm going to tighten the valves back down, put my valve covers back on, and then flip it back over and continue with main bearing number 2, I think it is. All right, I now have all the main bearings tightened. The last one today was number 2. And the Plastigage'd on it was 0.002, so it was 2 thousandths on the money. So all these clearances are good, and I rotated this engine around a little bit. It's not, obviously it doesn't free wheel because it's got 8 pistons attached to it, but and the friction of those. But The crank's easily rotating fine, so crank's good. I'm now about to take these caps off, Plastigage each of the rod bearings, and then try to seal this thing back up. All right, I'm now on my third bearing, Plastigage. In case you haven't seen Plastigage before in some of my other videos, show how this works. So you squeeze the wax string in between the bearing and torque it down, and then you measure, so we get a better shot. So that's the wax string that's been squeezed and compressed against the journal. And then you take the piece of paper that comes with the Plastigage or the Plastigage wrapper, and you check the width of the compressed string against this piece of paper. So you can see it's not as wide as the 0.0015, and it's just a tad wider than 0.002. So I'm going to say this bearing, at least on maybe over here on the side, it's almost probably 0.0016, 0.0017, but more here on this side, it's more like closer to 0.002, which is okay. This is acceptable. So this bearing to me is pretty close to, is mostly close to 0.002, maybe 0.0018, but the first two were 0.0018, so got the same on number 3. So far I've got 0.0018 on this one, 0.0018 on that one, and it looks like about 0.0018, at least on this side. On this one, maybe a little bit small, narrow, tighter on that other side. But that's bearing number 3. All right, I'm just about done. I'm on bearing number 7, and you can see that the Plastigage is, can't see anything from that, but I've already measured with the tape, with the paper, and it's just a tad tighter than 0.002. I'm gonna guess 0.018. It's narrower than the, it's wider than 0.02 and it's wider than 0.002 and much narrower than 0.0015, closer to 0.002. So I'm gonna say it's 0.0018, somewhere in that neighborhood. Every one of these have been about this, so all of these have been just a tad under 0.002, which is good. So that's number 7. I'm gonna go ahead and check number 8 and then wrap this up. And that's the once I get done with these bearings and tighten them up for the last time, this the rotating assembly, the bottom half will be done, and I've got to seal it back up. I've got to put the oil pump back on, front cover back on, put the what do you call it, not a splash shield, windage tray. Put the windage tray back on, put the oil pump pickup back on, put the front and rear coverage back on and align them flush with the block, put some sealant on it, put the oil pan on, and it'll be sealed back up. So I'm not gonna put that on this video because this video is already long enough, and I'll refer you to my the original build video on this engine where I did that. So this wraps up this video on how to put in a crank on an engine that's already been assembled. It can be done. It's tedious. And if you want to do it right, you need to use Plastigage. It's hard to use a dial bore gauge when everything's already in there and in the way. And I guess you could use a dial bore gauge on the main bearings, but I don't think you could do it on the pistons because you can't get the dial bore gauge down in there. So that wraps it up. You can replace a crank on an engine that's already been built. You can tear it back down, tear the bottom end down, and reinstall the new crankshaft and put it back together. Thanks for watching. Sorry the video's so long, but I want to make sure I cover everything. Please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications if you want to see some more.